Everyone feared the alien millionaire, until the rookie waitress silenced him in front of all. The silence that fell over the Silver Creek Saloon at exactly 8:47 on a Friday evening was so complete that the sound of Augustus Blackwood's silver-tipped boots on the wooden floor echoed like gunshots through the crowded room. Every conversation died mid-sentence, every card game froze in place, and every glass stopped halfway to trembling lips as the most powerful man in 3 territories made his evening entrance with the casual arrogance of someone who owned not just the saloon, but the entire town, the surrounding ranches, and quite possibly the souls of everyone present. Augustus stood 6.5 feet tall in his hand-tailored black suit, his pale skin seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, while his eyes held depths that suggested intelligence accumulated over lifetimes rather than mere decades. When he smiled, which he did often and never warmly, his teeth gleamed with the kind of perfection that made observant people wonder if they were entirely natural. But what made grown men step aside and saloon girls find urgent business elsewhere was not his imposing physical presence. It was the subtle wrongness that emanated from him like heat from a forge, the sense that something fundamental about Augustus Blackwood did not belong in any world that humans were meant to inhabit. The bartender, a burly man named Pete, who had once faced down armed desperados without flinching, became a study in nervous efficiency as Augustus approached the bar. Without being asked, Pete poured 3 fingers of the saloon's most expensive whiskey into a crystal glass that was kept reserved specifically for this one customer, his hands shaking just enough to make the bottle clink against the rim. "Evening, Mr. Blackwood," Pete managed, his voice carrying the carefully neutral tone of someone who had learned that showing either too much deference or too little could have consequences that extended far beyond simple business transactions. "The usual table is ready for you, sir, and I'll have your dinner sent over directly." Augustus accepted the whiskey without acknowledgement, his pale gray eyes scanning the room with the kind of systematic attention that made everyone present feel as though they were being evaluated for purposes they couldn't imagine and probably wouldn't want to understand. His gaze lingered on faces that showed signs of financial stress, on clothing that indicated recent hardship, on the subtle body language that revealed who owed money to whom and how desperate their circumstances had become. What none of the saloon's patrons could have known was that Augustus Blackwood was not the simple robber baron he appeared to be, any more than his wealth came from the gold mines, cattle operations, and railroad interests that served as his public businesses. For 38 years, he had been the primary resource extraction coordinator for the Dominion of Distant Suns, an interstellar empire that specialized in identifying valuable worlds and systematically stripping them of anything useful before moving on to the next target in their expansion pattern. Earth had been selected for long-term resource extraction because of its abundant raw materials, its strategic location along several hyperspace routes, and most importantly, its primitive human population that could be manipulated and controlled through economic pressure rather than expensive military occupation. Augustus's mission was to acquire as much of the planet's wealth as possible, while keeping the indigenous population docile and compliant through debt, dependency, and carefully managed desperation. His methods were ruthlessly effective because they operated within the framework of human legal and social systems, while serving alien interests that no human authority could detect or challenge. He loaned money at rates that guaranteed eventual default, bought properties at forced sales for fractions of their value, and created economic conditions that made entire communities dependent on his continued goodwill for their basic survival. The town of Silver Creek existed now primarily to serve Augustus's interests, its economy controlled by businesses he owned, its government influenced by officials who owed their positions to his support, and its population trapped in cycles of debt and dependency that made resistance both dangerous and apparently futile. He had achieved what amounted to colonial dominance over a significant portion of the American frontier without firing a single shot or revealing anything about his true nature or ultimate objectives. But Augustus's evening routine of surveying his domain and reminding the locals of their subordinate status was interrupted by the arrival of someone whose presence in his carefully controlled environment represented a variable that his comprehensive intelligence gathering had failed to anticipate. The young woman who pushed through the saloon's batwing doors carried herself with the kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested either complete ignorance of local power dynamics or the sort of courage that didn't care about consequences when principles were at stake. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, carried a cloth bag that contained what appeared to be all her worldly possessions, and moved through the hostile silence of the saloon with the confidence of someone who had never learned to be intimidated by other people's wealth or authority. "Excuse me," she said to Pete the bartender, her voice carrying the clear vowels of someone who had received at least basic education despite her obviously modest circumstances. "I'm Clara Thompson, and I'm here about the waitress position that was advertised in the territorial newspaper. I know I don't have an appointment, but I was hoping someone might have a few minutes to speak with me about the work." The effect of her words on the saloon's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Every patron in the room understood that Clara Thompson had just made a request that would require Augustus Blackwood's approval, and that approaching him for employment while he was conducting his evening survey of his holdings was exactly the sort of presumption that had resulted in other people leaving Silver Creek under circumstances that were never quite explained, but were always understood to be permanent. Pete's face went pale as he realized that he was about to become the conduit for a conversation that could easily result in the kind of unpleasantness that would require extensive cleanup and careful explanation to territorial authorities. "Miss," he said quietly, "this might not be the best time to discuss employment opportunities. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow morning when—" "Nonsense," Augustus interrupted, his voice carrying easily across the silent saloon despite being pitched at conversational levels. "The young lady is here now, and I'm always interested in meeting potential employees. Miss Thompson, was it? Please join me at my table and we can discuss your qualifications and my expectations." The invitation was delivered with the kind of cold courtesy that made it clear that refusal was not an option, while the slight emphasis on "my expectations" carried implications that made several saloon girls exchange meaningful glances and edge closer to the exits. Augustus Blackwood's interviews with potential female employees were notorious for including requirements that had nothing to do with serving food and drinks, and his ability to make rejection of those requirements extremely costly meant that most women in Silver Creek had learned to avoid seeking work that would bring them to his personal attention. Clara Thompson, however, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of threat and exploitation that permeated the conversation. She walked directly to Augustus's table with the kind of straightforward confidence that suggested she viewed the upcoming discussion as a normal business negotiation between equals, completely missing the signs of predatory intent that were obvious to everyone else in the room. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume," she said, extending her hand for a business-like handshake rather than the deferential curtsy that he typically received from women seeking his favor. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I have experience serving food and drinks from working in restaurants in Denver and Colorado Springs, and I'm prepared to work hard for fair wages in a professional environment." Augustus's reaction to her direct approach and confident manner revealed aspects of his personality that even longtime residents of Silver Creek had rarely seen. Instead of the immediate assertion of dominance that characterized his usual interactions with people he considered beneath his notice, he found himself genuinely curious about someone who seemed immune to the atmosphere of fear and submission that he had worked so carefully to create. "Miss Thompson," he said, gesturing for her to take the seat across from him while studying her with the kind of systematic attention that he usually reserved for evaluating business opportunities. "Your confidence is refreshing. Tell me, what brings you to Silver Creek specifically? We're not exactly on the main routes between Denver and more prosperous territories." Clara's answer revealed both practical intelligence and the kind of moral clarity that Augustus had not encountered during his decades of manipulating human greed and weakness. She explained that she had come to Silver Creek because she had heard it was a growing community where hardworking people could build better lives for themselves, and that she was looking for a place where she could contribute to that growth while earning enough to eventually bring her younger siblings west to join her. But what made Augustus's enhanced alien senses register alarm was not Clara's stated motivations, but the electromagnetic signatures that his sophisticated detection capabilities were picking up from her apparently simple human physiology. The readings were subtle but unmistakable. Clara Thompson was not entirely human, any more than Augustus himself was entirely what he appeared to be. The realization that he was facing another being with hidden alien heritage forced Augustus to reconsider both his assessment of the situation and his approach to dealing with this unexpected complication. Clara's apparent ignorance of his true nature and her confident manner suggested that she was either an extremely skilled deceiver or genuinely unaware of her own non-human capabilities. The conversation that followed was unlike any Augustus had experienced during his years of dominating Silver Creek's population through economic pressure, and psychological intimidation. Clara responded to his increasingly pointed questions about her background and intentions with the kind of honest directness that revealed no hidden agendas while simultaneously demonstrating intelligence and strength of character that impressed even his cynical evaluation of human nature. More importantly, she seemed genuinely unimpressed by his wealth and power, treating him as simply another potential employer whose business practices and personal character would need to meet her standards before she would consider working for him. Her questions about working conditions, treatment of employees, and company policies revealed expectations of dignity and fairness that challenged assumptions about economic relationships that Augustus had considered fundamental to human social organization. The turning point in their discussion came when Augustus, testing the limits of her apparent naivety, made a suggestion about additional services that his female employees were expected to provide in exchange for premium wages and job security. The implication was delivered with the kind of subtle threat that had proven effective with dozens of other women who had sought employment in his various businesses. Clara's response was immediate, decisive, and delivered with a clarity that cut through the saloon's tense atmosphere like a blade through silk. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that made Augustus's alien hearing detect levels of controlled power that he had not suspected she possessed. "If you are suggesting that employment with your businesses requires anything other than honest work for fair wages, then you have misunderstood both my character and my intentions. I am here to earn a living through respectable labor, not to provide entertainment for men who confuse wealth with worthiness." The silence that followed Clara's words was profound and dangerous, charged with implications that extended far beyond a simple employment negotiation. Every person in the saloon understood that Augustus Blackwood had just been publicly rejected and implicitly criticized by someone who apparently did not understand or care about the consequences of defying the most powerful man in the territory. But Augustus's reaction was not the explosive anger or cold threat that longtime residents had learned to expect when their master's authority was challenged. Instead, he found himself experiencing something he had not felt during his decades of colonial exploitation: genuine respect for someone whose principles could not be compromised by either fear or economic pressure. "Miss Thompson," he said after a long moment, his voice carrying new tones that suggested reassessment of both the situation and his own assumptions, "you have made your position quite clear, and I find your directness educational. Perhaps we should start this conversation over, with a better understanding of what each of us is looking for in an employment arrangement." What followed was perhaps the most honest negotiation Augustus had conducted in 38 years of extracting wealth from human desperation. Clara's questions about wages, working conditions, and employee treatment forced him to consider business practices from perspectives that he had never bothered to examine, while her obvious intelligence and strength of character made him realize that she represented possibilities that his standard approaches to human resource management could never access. More importantly, their conversation revealed that Clara's apparent immunity to his usual methods of control and intimidation was not based on ignorance, but on a moral foundation that could not be shaken by threats or compromised by offers of personal advantage. She evaluated him and his proposals according to standards that had nothing to do with his wealth or power, and everything to do with whether his behavior met criteria for decency and fairness that she considered non-negotiable. The employment agreement they eventually reached was unlike any Augustus had made during his years of colonial exploitation. Clara would work as a waitress in the saloon for wages that were significantly higher than he usually paid, with working conditions that included respect for her dignity and protection from the kind of harassment that had driven away other female employees. In exchange, she would bring to her work the kind of professionalism and competence that could transform his establishment from a place where desperate people gathered to drink away their problems into a business that actually served its community's legitimate needs while still generating the profits that his alien supervisors required. But the most significant change was in Augustus himself. Clara's presence in his carefully controlled environment introduced variables that forced him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature, colonial exploitation, and the methods that he had been using to extract wealth from Earth's population. The months that followed Clara's arrival transformed not just the Silver Creek Saloon, but the entire town's social and economic dynamics. Her professional competence and personal integrity set new standards for business behavior that other establishments found themselves trying to match, while her obvious lack of fear regarding Augustus Blackwood gave other residents courage to approach him with proposals and requests that they had previously been too intimidated to voice. More importantly, Clara's influence on Augustus's behavior began extending beyond their workplace interactions to affect his entire approach to managing his various business interests. Her questions about the fairness of his lending practices, the reasonableness of his property acquisition methods, and the ethics of his economic control over the community forced him to examine his colonial mission from perspectives that his training had never encouraged him to consider. The crisis that would test both Clara's principles and Augustus's evolving understanding of his relationship with the human community came when his alien supervisors arrived for their scheduled inspection of his extraction operations. The Dominion representatives expected to find a thoroughly exploited population, providing maximum resource transfer with minimum overhead costs, and they were not prepared to encounter evidence of what they would consider unauthorized charity toward the indigenous inhabitants. Clara's presence during the inspection created complications that neither she nor Augustus had anticipated. Her obvious influence over local business practices and her fearless approach to dealing with authority figures represented exactly the kind of indigenous leadership that Dominion policy was designed to eliminate before it could threaten colonial efficiency. The confrontation that developed when Clara challenged the visitors' attitudes toward the local population and their obvious disdain for human dignity created the kind of diplomatic incident that colonial operations were supposed to prevent. Her refusal to be intimidated by beings whose technological capabilities far exceeded anything humans were supposed to be able to resist forced Augustus to make a choice between his colonial mission and his growing commitment to protecting someone whose courage and integrity had earned his respect. The decision that Augustus made in that moment would have consequences that extended far beyond Silver Creek to influence Dominion policy throughout their expansion zone. His protection of Clara and his defense of the changes she had inspired in local business practices represented a fundamental challenge to colonial assumptions about indigenous population management and resource extraction efficiency. The victory they achieved together established precedents for human-alien cooperation that would eventually lead to recognition of Earth as a protected world rather than a colonial target. Clara's courage in standing up to apparently superior forces had inspired Augustus to rediscover principles that his colonial training had taught him to abandon, while his protection of her had demonstrated that even systems designed for exploitation could be changed when individuals chose principles over profit. Years later, as Clara and Augustus worked together to manage businesses that served their community's needs while contributing to interstellar trade networks based on mutual benefit rather than colonial extraction, they often reflected on the evening when a rookie waitress had silenced a powerful alien in front of everyone who had assumed such a thing was impossible. The fear that had once characterized everyone's relationship with Augustus Blackwood had been replaced by respect, earned through fair dealing and genuine concern for community welfare. The waitress who had seemed so naive and vulnerable had proven to be exactly what both he and Silver Creek needed, someone whose principles could not be compromised and whose courage could inspire others to discover their own capacity for standing up to injustice. The alien millionaire who had once ruled through fear and economic manipulation had learned that true power came not from dominating others, but from earning their trust and using one's advantages to create opportunities for everyone to prosper. The rookie waitress who had silenced him had given him something far more valuable than the wealth he had been extracting from Earth. She had given him the chance to become worthy of the respect that his position had always commanded, through intimidation rather than merit. In the end, their partnership had proven that the most powerful force in the universe was not superior technology or overwhelming wealth, but the simple courage to treat others with dignity and to stand up for principles that recognize the inherent worth of every conscious being, regardless of which world they called home or how much power they wielded in service of others' ambitions.